Sometimes the cruelest betrayals come from those who promise to love you forever. What began as a desperate escape from a marriage that reduced her worth to her womb became a journey that would reveal the true meaning of family, purpose, and the extraordinary power that lies within every woman who refuses to be defined by others' limitations. This isn't just about surviving abandonment, it's about discovering that your greatest perceived weakness can become your most powerful strength. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the courthouse in Cedar Falls, Iowa, each drop seeming to echo the hollow beating of Sarah Mitchell's heart as she sat in the wooden chair, watching her husband of 8 years sign papers that would dissolve their marriage and transfer her like property to settle a gambling debt. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the face of the man she'd once believed would protect her from the world's cruelties, not become the architect of her deepest humiliation. Daniel Mitchell's signature was confident, practiced, the same signature that had once signed their marriage certificate with trembling hands and whispered promises of forever. Now it moved across the divorce papers with the cold efficiency of a business transaction, because that's exactly what this was. Sarah wasn't a wife being divorced. She was collateral being transferred to cover the $50,000 debt Daniel owed to Marcus Thornfield, a man whose wealth could buy silence, influence, and apparently human beings. "It's for the best, Sarah," Daniel muttered without looking at her, his voice carrying the hollow ring of a man trying to convince himself of his own lies. "You know we've tried everything. The doctors said, well, they said what they said. Marcus can provide for you in ways I never could. He's got connections, resources. Maybe with him you'll finally—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Sarah heard the unspoken words anyway. "Maybe with him you'll finally become the woman you were supposed to be. Maybe with him you'll finally fulfill your only purpose." Sarah stared at her hands folded in her lap. Hands that had held negative pregnancy test after negative pregnancy test for 8 years. Hands that had been examined by countless doctors, who spoke about her body like it was a machine with broken parts that simply couldn't be fixed. She'd endured procedures that left her feeling like a specimen under a microscope. Treatments that drained their savings and her spirit, all while Daniel grew more distant with each failed attempt. The lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, who looked uncomfortable with the unusual nature of the proceedings, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Mitchell, you'll need to sign here as well, acknowledging the dissolution of marriage and the arrangement with Mr. Thornfield." Sarah looked up for the first time since entering the courthouse, meeting the lawyer's eyes with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "And if I refuse?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that threatened to consume everything. Daniel's face flushed red, whether from shame or anger. Sarah couldn't tell anymore. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his chair, consulting his papers as if they might contain answers to questions that had no legal precedent. "Sarah, please," Daniel said, his voice taking on the wheedling tone she'd grown to despise over the past year. "You know what Marcus is capable of. The debt isn't going away, and neither are his methods of collection. This way, at least, you'll be safe, comfortable. He's promised to treat you well. Treat you well." The words echoed in Sarah's mind like a death knell. She was 29 years old, college-educated, had worked as a nurse before Daniel convinced her to quit and focus on their future family. Now she was being discussed like livestock, her value reduced to her reproductive capacity or lack thereof. Marcus Thornfield sat in the corner of the room, silent and observing. He was a man in his 50s, silver-haired and expensively dressed, with the kind of quiet authority that came from never having to raise his voice to get what he wanted. His steel-grey eyes assessed Sarah with the cold calculation of someone appraising property, and when their gazes met, she saw something that made her blood run cold: satisfaction. This wasn't just about Daniel's debt. This was about power, control, and the particular cruelty of a man who collected beautiful, broken things. "Mr. Thornfield has been very generous," the lawyer continued, his voice growing more confident as he returned to familiar legal territory. "The arrangement includes full financial support, housing at his estate in Vermont, and access to the finest medical care. Should the situation change regarding children, all provisions remain in place." Sarah almost laughed at the euphemism. Should the situation change? As if her infertility was a temporary inconvenience, rather than the fundamental flaw that had led to this moment. 8 years of marriage had taught her that in a world where a woman's worth was measured by her ability to produce heirs, she was essentially worthless. A fact that Daniel had made increasingly clear with every failed pregnancy test, every doctor's appointment that ended in disappointment, every family gathering where relatives asked with painful optimism about good news. The irony wasn't lost on her that Marcus Thornfield, a man with 3 ex-wives and no children of his own, was acquiring her specifically because she couldn't give him what his previous wives had failed to provide either. But for Marcus, Sarah suspected the inability to bear children wasn't a liability. It was a feature. A woman who couldn't get pregnant couldn't threaten his carefully constructed world with the complications of offspring, inheritance, or the messy emotional bonds that children created. "I need a moment," Sarah said quietly, standing from her chair with a grace that belied the storm raging inside her chest. She walked to the courthouse window and stared out at the rain-soaked streets of Cedar Falls, the small Iowa town where she'd been born, raised, and had planned to raise her own children someday. The buildings looked grey and tired in the autumn drizzle, much like everything else in her life had begun to feel over the past few years. Behind her, she could hear Daniel's nervous breathing and the quiet rustling of papers as the lawyer organized documents. Marcus remained silent, patient in the way that powerful men could afford to be when they knew the outcome was inevitable. Sarah thought about her childhood dreams of motherhood, the names she'd chosen for babies who would never exist. The nursery. She'd painted and repainted in 3 different houses as Daniel's business ventures failed one after another. She thought about her mother's disappointment, thinly veiled behind forced smiles and suggestions for new fertility treatments. She thought about her sister's children, beautiful and beloved, and the way conversations stopped when Sarah entered rooms where mothers were sharing stories of school plays and soccer games. But mostly, she thought about the woman she'd been, before the world convinced her that her only value lay in her ability to reproduce. The woman who'd graduated summa cum laude with a nursing degree, who'd once dreamed of opening a free clinic for underserved communities, who'd believed she could change the world through healing and compassion rather than biology and bloodlines. That woman had been buried under years of medical appointments, hormone treatments, and the gradual erosion of her self-worth that came from being treated like a failed investment by the man who'd promised to love her unconditionally. But maybe, Sarah realized with startling clarity, that woman wasn't dead. Maybe she was just sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up. "I'll sign," Sarah said, turning back to face the room. Her voice was steady, but there was something in her tone that made Daniel look up sharply and caused Marcus to lean forward slightly in his chair. She returned to the table and picked up the pen, feeling its weight as if it were a sword rather than a simple writing instrument. With deliberate precision, she signed her name, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, for the last time. When she finished, she set the pen down and looked directly at Marcus Thornfield. "I want to be clear about something," she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength that filled the small room. You may think you're buying a broken woman, someone grateful for your charity and willing to disappear into whatever role you've imagined for me. But you're not getting damaged goods. You're getting someone who's finally free from the expectations that were destroying her soul." Marcus's expression shifted slightly, surprise flickering across his carefully controlled features. Daniel looked between them nervously, as if sensing that the transaction he'd orchestrated wasn't proceeding according to his plan. "I'll come with you," Sarah continued, standing and gathering her purse. "I'll honor whatever arrangement you've made with my former husband. But understand this, you haven't purchased my spirit, my intelligence, or my dreams. You've simply given me the opportunity to discover what I'm truly capable of when I'm not constantly being measured against someone else's definition of womanhood." The lawyer shuffled his papers nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the turn. The conversation had taken. Daniel's face had gone pale, perhaps finally realizing that he'd lost something far more valuable than the money he owed. Marcus Thornfield stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured tone of a man accustomed to getting his way through patience rather than force. "Mrs. Mitchell, or should I say Ms. Henderson, since you'll be returning to your maiden name, I think you may find our arrangement more enlightening than you expect. My estate in Vermont is quite isolated, which I believe will suit your need for privacy as you adjust to your new circumstances." Sarah heard the threat wrapped in courtesy, the implicit warning that isolation could be a prison as easily as a sanctuary. But she also heard something else, uncertainty. Marcus Thornfield was a man who collected and controlled beautiful things, but he'd never encountered something that refused to stay broken. As they left the courthouse together, Sarah caught her reflection in the rain-streaked glass of the entrance doors. The woman looking back at her wasn't the defeated victim she'd expected to see. Instead, she saw someone who looked oddly liberated, as if shedding the weight of 8 years of marriage had revealed a strength she'd forgotten she possessed. The drive to Vermont took most of the day, winding through small towns and increasingly rural landscapes as they traveled north. Marcus drove a black luxury sedan with tinted windows, the kind of vehicle that announced wealth without ostentation. He spoke little during the journey, making occasional phone calls in low, clipped tones that suggested business dealings Sarah wasn't meant to understand. She stared out the passenger window, watching the October landscape transform from the familiar farmlands of Iowa to the rolling hills and dense forests of New England. With each mile, she felt herself moving further from the life that had defined and confined her, traveling toward something unknown but undeniably different. As evening approached and the mountains of Vermont rose before them like sleeping giants, Sarah realized she wasn't afraid. She should have been. She was traveling with a stranger to an isolated location, bound by an arrangement that reduced her to property. But instead of fear, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Possibility. The road ahead was uncertain, potentially dangerous, and completely beyond her control. But for the first time since her wedding day 8 years ago, Sarah Henderson was exactly where she chose to be, heading toward a future that belonged entirely to her. The estate appeared suddenly as they crested a hill, its windows glowing golden, against the darkening sky. It was larger than Sarah had expected, a sprawling Victorian mansion that spoke of old money and older secrets. As Marcus pulled into the circular driveway, Sarah straightened her shoulders and prepared to meet whatever challenges awaited her. She was no longer the broken woman who'd sat in that courthouse chair hours earlier. She was someone new, someone whose story was just beginning, someone who would prove that a woman's worth couldn't be measured by her womb alone. The game was about to begin, and Sarah Henderson was finally ready to play, preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The interior of the Thornfield mansion revealed itself like the pages of a Gothic novel, each room more opulent and unwelcoming than the last. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across Persian rugs and mahogany furniture that looked as if it had been carefully arranged to impress rather than comfort. Sarah followed Marcus through the grand foyer, her footsteps echoing on marble. Floors that probably cost more than most people's houses. "Mrs. Carmichael will show you to your quarters," Marcus said, gesturing to a stern-faced woman who materialized from a side corridor as if she'd been waiting in the shadows. The housekeeper was perhaps 60, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that assessed Sarah with the cool efficiency of someone accustomed to managing inconvenient situations. "Good evening, Miss Henderson," Mrs. Carmichael said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Sarah couldn't immediately place. "I trust the journey wasn't too taxing. Mr. Thornfield prefers his household to maintain certain standards of conduct. I'm sure you'll find them quite reasonable once you're settled." Sarah detected layers of meaning in the woman's polite words, warnings, wrapped in courtesy, boundaries established through seemingly innocent conversation. This was clearly a household where every interaction was carefully choreographed, where spontaneity was discouraged and conformity was expected. "I'll leave you in Mrs. Carmichael's capable hands," Marcus said, checking his expensive watch. "I have business calls to attend to. We'll discuss your situation more thoroughly tomorrow morning. Breakfast is served at 8 sharp in the small dining room." He disappeared into what Sarah assumed was his office, leaving her alone with the housekeeper, who studied her with unconcealed curiosity. Mrs. Carmichael had obviously seen other women arrive at the estate under similar circumstances, and her expression suggested she was trying to determine which category Sarah would fall into. "If you'll follow me," Mrs. Carmichael said, leading Sarah up a grand staircase lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to disapprove of everything they surveyed. "Your rooms are in the east wing. Mr. Thornfield thought you'd appreciate the morning light and the view of the gardens." The guest suite was larger than the apartment Sarah had shared with Daniel during their first year of marriage. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked formal gardens that probably required a team of groundskeepers to maintain, while a sitting area with antique furniture created the impression of refined imprisonment. Everything was beautiful, expensive, and completely impersonal. The wardrobe has been stocked with appropriate clothing. Mrs. Carmichael continued, opening carved wooden doors to reveal an array of dresses, sweaters, and shoes that were clearly expensive, but strangely uniform in their conservative styling. "Mr. Thornfield prefers his household to maintain a certain aesthetic. I'm sure you understand." Sarah fingered the fabric of a navy blue dress that looked like something a 1950s housewife might wear to church. The message was clear. Her own clothes, her own style, her own identity were not welcome here. She was expected to transform herself into whatever image Marcus Thornfield preferred for his latest acquisition. "Dinner is served at 7, Mrs. Carmichael continued, consulting a small notebook she pulled from her apron pocket. "Mr. Thornfield doesn't typically dine with guests during their first week. He finds it helps with the adjustment period. Your meals will be served here in your sitting room until he determines you're ready for more." Integrated participation in household routines. Adjustment period. Integrated participation. The clinical language couldn't disguise what was really happening. Sarah was being isolated, observed, and gradually conditioned to accept her new role as a decorative prisoner in Marcus Thornfield's carefully controlled world. "Are there other guests in the house?" Sarah asked, testing the boundaries of acceptable conversation. Mrs. Carmichael's expression flickered almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Thornfield values his privacy. The household staff understands the importance of discretion. I'm sure you'll find the same wisdom in focusing on your own adjustment rather than concerning yourself with matters that don't directly affect you." Another warning, delivered with the same polite efficiency. Sarah was being told, in no uncertain terms, that curiosity about her surroundings would not be tolerated. She was expected to exist in her luxurious cage without questioning what lay beyond its borders. After Mrs. Carmichael left, Sarah stood at the windows watching darkness settle over the Vermont landscape. The estate was even more isolated than she'd realized. No neighboring houses were visible, no lights suggested nearby civilization. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of wind through trees that formed a natural barrier around the property. She explored her suite methodically, looking for signs of previous occupants or clues about Marcus Thornfield's intentions. The bathroom was stocked with expensive toiletries, all in scents that were pleasant but unfamiliar. The bedroom contained fresh flowers that were beautiful but somehow sterile, as if they'd been chosen for visual impact rather than fragrance or personal preference. In the sitting room, Sarah discovered a bookshelf filled with classic literature. Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, all female authors whose heroines had struggled against the constraints of their societies. Whether this was intentional irony or unconscious revelation, Sarah couldn't tell, but she found herself wondering if previous women had sat in this same chair, reading about fictional characters who'd fought for their independence while trapped. In similar circumstances, dinner arrived promptly at 7, wheeled in on a silver cart by a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20. The girl kept her eyes downcast and spoke only to ask if Sarah needed anything else, her nervous demeanor suggesting she'd been strictly instructed about appropriate behavior around the household's newest resident. The meal was exquisite. Roasted chicken with herbs that tasted like they'd been grown on the property, vegetables that were perfectly prepared, wine that probably cost more than Sarah had spent on groceries in a month during her marriage. But eating alone in the elegant sitting room felt like performing in a play for an audience of one, every bite monitored and evaluated by invisible eyes. As night deepened, Sarah found herself listening to the sounds of the house, footsteps in distant corridors, muffled conversations that never came close enough to understand, the occasional creak of old wood settling. The estate felt alive with secrets, populated by people who moved through their routines with the careful precision of actors who knew they were always being watched. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams that mixed memories of her failed marriage with anxieties about her uncertain future. She woke several times, disoriented by the unfamiliar room and the absolute silence that surrounded the estate like a protective barrier against the outside world. Morning brought her first real test. Mrs. Carmichael arrived precisely at 7:30 with coffee and pastries, along with a dress that was clearly intended to be Sarah's outfit for her breakfast meeting with Marcus Thornfield. "Mr. Thornfield appreciates punctuality," the housekeeper said, laying the dress across the bed with ritualistic care. "He also values appropriate presentation. I'm sure you'll want to make a positive impression during your first formal interaction." As a member of his household, the dress was dove grey with pearl buttons, conservative but flattering, designed to enhance Sarah's natural beauty while ensuring she looked like a respectable ornament rather than an independent woman. Wearing it felt like putting on a costume for a role she hadn't auditioned for, but was expected to perform flawlessly. The small dining room was intimate compared to the rest of the house, with windows that overlooked the formal gardens where early morning mist created an almost ethereal atmosphere. Marcus sat at the head of a table that could have seated 8, reading a newspaper while sipping coffee from bone china that probably cost more than most people's weekly salaries. "Good morning, Sarah," he said without looking up from his paper. "I trust you slept well. Mrs. Carmichael mentioned you seemed appropriately receptive to the household routines." Sarah took the seat that had obviously been prepared for her, noting that her place setting was positioned to give Marcus a clear view of her while keeping her at a respectful distance. Everything about the arrangement reinforced the power dynamic he was establishing. "The accommodations are very comfortable," she replied carefully, testing how much honesty would be tolerated in their conversations. Marcus folded his newspaper and finally looked at her directly. His grey eyes were intelligent and calculating, assessing her appearance and demeanor with the thoroughness of someone evaluating a potential investment. "I'm glad you approve. I've found that comfort facilitates cooperation. And cooperation, Sarah, is essential for the success of our arrangement." He paused to sip his coffee, letting the weight of his words settle between them. "I'm sure you have questions about your new circumstances. This seems like an appropriate time to address them." Sarah had spent most of the night preparing for this conversation, organizing her thoughts and strategies for navigating what she knew would be a crucial interaction. Everything about her future here would be determined by how she handled the next few minutes. "I'd like to understand what you expect from me," she said, keeping her voice steady and professional. The legal arrangements covered financial obligations, but they didn't specify daily responsibilities or long-term expectations. Marcus smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Direct. I appreciate that quality in a woman when it's properly channeled. My expectations are quite simple. Actually, you'll be a companion, a conversation partner for social events, and a beautiful addition to my household. Nothing more strenuous than what you might have provided in your marriage, but with considerably more appreciation for your efforts." The pause before appreciation carried implications that made Sarah's skin crawl. She was being told, in polite language, that she was expected to be decorative, compliant, and available for whatever purposes Marcus deemed appropriate. "And if I find those expectations incompatible with my own goals?" she asked, pushing against the boundaries of acceptable conversation. Marcus set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Goals? How interesting. I was under the impression that your previous circumstances had made traditional goals somewhat irrelevant. But please enlighten me. What goals does a woman in your situation typically pursue?" The question was designed to humiliate, to remind Sarah that her infertility had supposedly rendered her worthless by conventional standards. But instead of shame, she felt something unexpected: clarity. Marcus Thornfield was a predator who fed on broken women, but Sarah was discovering she wasn't as broken as everyone had assumed. "I was a nurse before my marriage," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "I specialized in pediatric care, actually. Ironic considering my personal limitations, but I was quite good at healing children, even if I couldn't create them." Something shifted in Marcus's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. He hadn't expected her to volunteer information about her professional background, especially something that highlighted her competence rather than her perceived failures. "Nursing, how practical. I don't suppose you've maintained your licensing through all those years of trying to fulfill your wifely duties?" The mockery in his tone was unmistakable, but Sarah refused to let it affect her. "Actually, I have. Professional development was one of the few things Daniel supported during our marriage. He thought medical knowledge might help with our fertility issues." Marcus leaned back in his chair, reassessing her with new attention. Sarah realized she'd just revealed something he hadn't expected. She wasn't completely dependent on his charity. She had skills, credentials, and the potential for independence that could complicate his plans for control. "How fascinating," he said slowly. "Perhaps we should discuss ways your talents might be useful here at the estate. I occasionally entertain guests who might benefit from having medical expertise available. Nothing too strenuous, of course, but your background could prove valuable. Sarah heard the subtle shift in his tone. Marcus Thornfield was a businessman first and foremost, and he'd just realized his newest acquisition might be more asset than ornament. The recognition created new possibilities and new dangers. As breakfast concluded and Marcus excused himself for business calls, Sarah remained at the table, staring out at the misty gardens. She was beginning to understand that surviving the Thornfield estate would require more than passive compliance. She needed to become indispensable, to find ways to carve out space for her own agency within the constraints of her circumstances. The game had indeed begun, but the rules were more complex than either of them had initially realized. Sarah Henderson was about to discover that her greatest perceived weakness, her inability to bear children, might actually be the key to a freedom she'd never imagined possible. 3 days into her residency at the Thornfield estate, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything she thought she understood about her situation. It happened by accident, the kind of fortunate mistake that reveals truths people have worked hard to conceal. She'd been exploring the mansion's labyrinthine corridors during the afternoon hours when Marcus was locked in his office, conducting business calls in languages she couldn't identify. The estate's isolation had become oppressive, and Sarah found herself desperate for any form of mental stimulation beyond the carefully curated books in her suite and the stilted conversations with Mrs. Carmichael. The third floor had been declared off-limits during her initial tour, dismissed by the housekeeper as storage areas and servant quarters of no interest to guests. But Sarah's nursing background had taught her that forbidden areas often contained the most important information, whether in hospitals or, apparently, in mysterious Vermont mansions. The corridor was dimmer than the rest of the house, lit by outdated fixtures that cast dancing shadows across faded wallpaper. Most of the doors were locked, but one stood slightly ajar, revealing a slice of afternoon sunlight that seemed to beckon her forward. Sarah pushed the door open carefully, expecting to find dusty furniture or forgotten holiday decorations. Instead, she discovered a fully furnished bedroom that looked recently occupied. The bed was made with military precision, personal items were arranged on the dresser with careful attention to order, and the air carried the faint scent of lavender, perfume. But it was the photographs scattered across a small writing desk that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. They showed a young woman with dark hair and sad eyes, captured in various poses around the estate grounds. In some photos, she was reading in the garden. In others, she stood at the same windows Sarah had been staring through, her expression distant and melancholy. The woman looked to be in her early 20s, beautiful in the way that suggested vulnerability rather than strength. And in every photograph, she wore the same style of conservative dresses that now hung in Sarah's wardrobe, as if she were performing the same role, following the same script that had been written for Sarah. "You shouldn't be here." Sarah spun around to find Mrs. Carmichael standing in the doorway, her usual composure cracked to reveal something that looked like genuine distress. The housekeeper's hands were trembling slightly as she gripped the door frame, and her face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "I was just exploring," Sarah said, keeping her voice calm despite her racing heart. "The door was open and I was curious about—" "Curiosity is a dangerous luxury in this house," Mrs. Carmichael interrupted, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "Especially curiosity about matters that don't concern you." But something in the housekeeper's tone suggested conflict rather than anger. Sarah studied the older woman's face, noting the way her eyes lingered on the photographs with what looked like grief rather than mere annoyance. "Who was she?" Sarah asked gently, gesturing toward the pictures. Mrs. Carmichael was quiet for so long that Sarah thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that spoke of carefully guarded secrets and long-held regrets. Her name was Emily Patterson. She was in a situation similar to yours. Her family had debts, and Mr. Thornfield offered a solution that seemed beneficial to everyone involved. Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. What happened to her? She lived here for almost 2 years. She was a sweet girl, artistic, gentle. She tried very hard to please Mr. Thornfield, to fulfill whatever role he'd envisioned for her. Mrs. Carmichael moved to the desk and touched one of the photographs with infinite care, but she became problematic. She asked too many questions, wanted too much independence. She started talking about leaving, about finding work as an art teacher in Boston. The implication hung between them like a sword waiting to fall. Sarah forced herself to ask the question that was forming in her mind, even though she dreaded the answer. "Where is Emily now?" Mrs. Carmichael's expression became unreadable, the practiced neutrality of someone who'd learned to survive by revealing nothing. "There was an accident, a fall from the cliffs behind the estate. She was walking alone at night, apparently distressed about something. The local sheriff ruled it accidental death, caused by unfamiliarity with the terrain and poor visibility." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "You don't believe it was an accident?" "What I believe is irrelevant," Mrs. Carmichael replied sharply, but then her voice softened again. "What matters is that young women who push too hard against the boundaries of their circumstances sometimes find those boundaries unforgiving." The warning was clear, but Sarah detected something else in the housekeeper's manner. A plea, perhaps, or an attempt to save Sarah from Emily's fate. Mrs. Carmichael wasn't just Marcus Thornfield's employee. She was someone who'd grown attached to the vulnerable women who passed through the estate and had been forced to watch helplessly as they met unfortunate ends. "How many others have there been?" Sarah asked. Mrs. Carmichael's silence was answer enough. Sarah realized with growing horror that she wasn't Marcus Thornfield's first acquisition. She was simply the latest in a series of women who'd been collected, controlled, and ultimately disposed of when they became inconvenient. "Listen to me." "Carefully," Mrs. Carmichael said, moving closer and speaking in urgent whispers. "Mr. Thornfield is not a patient man, but he is a thorough one. He studies his companions extensively before deciding how to proceed with them. The women who survive are those who find ways to make themselves indispensable without appearing threatening." Sarah thought about her nursing background, about Marcus's interest in having medical expertise available for his guests. "What kind of guests does he entertain?" Mrs. Carmichael glanced nervously at the door, as if worried about being overheard. "Powerful men with complicated needs. Politicians who require discretion, businessmen who conduct affairs better kept from public scrutiny, occasionally individuals who require medical attention without the inconvenience of official documentation." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with sickening clarity. Marcus Thornfield wasn't just a wealthy collector of beautiful women. He was a facilitator for people whose activities required absolute privacy and unquestioning service. The isolated estate was perfect for hosting guests whose presence could never be officially acknowledged. "He wants me to provide medical care for these guests?" Sarah asked. "Among other services," Mrs. Carmichael replied delicately. "Your nursing background makes you uniquely valuable, but only if you demonstrate absolute loyalty and discretion. The moment Mr. Thornfield perceives you as a liability rather than an asset—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah understood perfectly. Emily Patterson's accident hadn't been an isolated incident. It was the standard solution for women who became problematic. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Why risk warning me?" Mrs. Carmichael's composure finally cracked, completely, revealing the pain she'd been carrying for years. Because I've watched too many bright young women disappear from this house. Because I've cleaned up too many accidents and smiled politely while sheriffs filed reports that everyone knew were lies. Because maybe, just maybe, you're strong enough to survive what the others couldn't. Sarah felt a surge of determination that surprised her with its intensity. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival anymore. She was carrying the hopes of every woman who'd been trapped in this beautiful prison. Every victim who trusted the wrong people and paid the ultimate price. What do I need to know to stay alive? She asked. Mrs. Carmichael looked relieved that Sarah was asking practical questions rather than breaking down in fear. First, never let him see you as weak or desperate. Men like Mr. Thornfield are predators. They lose interest in prey that doesn't provide enough challenge. Second, make yourself useful but not indispensable enough to threaten his control. Third, document everything. Find ways to create evidence that would surface if something happened to you. Sarah absorbed the advice, already beginning to formulate strategies for survival. Her nursing training had taught her to assess dangerous situations quickly and develop action plans under pressure. This was simply a different kind of emergency medicine. "The staff," she said. "Who can I trust?" "No one completely," Mrs. Carmichael replied honestly, "but some are more afraid of him than others. The gardener, Thomas Brennan, has been here the longest. He's seen the most, said the least. The cook, Maria Santos, cares about the women who pass through here, but she's terrified of losing her job. Her family in El Salvador depends on the money she sends home." Sarah made mental notes about potential allies while processing the disturbing revelation that she was living in a house where multiple people knew that women disappeared regularly but felt powerless to prevent it. "There's something else," Mrs. Carmichael said, glancing again at the photographs of Emily Patterson. "Mr. Thornfield keeps detailed files on all his companions, medical records, psychological profiles, personal histories. If you can access those files, you might learn something that could protect you." "Where does he keep them?" "His private office on the first floor. It's locked, of course, and he's very careful about security. But you're a nurse. You understand how to be invisible in places where people are focused on other things. And Mr. Thornfield has been distracted lately by some business problems that require his complete attention." Sarah realized that Mrs. Carmichael was offering her more than warnings. She was providing tactical intelligence that could mean the difference between survival and becoming another accident victim. As they prepared to leave Emily's preserved room, Sarah took one last look at the photographs scattered across the desk. The young woman's sad eyes seemed to be pleading with her, begging her to succeed where Emily had failed. "I won't end up like her," Sarah said quietly, more to Emily's memory than to Mrs. Carmichael. "I hope not," the housekeeper replied. "But hope isn't enough in this house. You'll need to be smarter, stronger, and more ruthless than any of the women who came before you." As they descended to the main floor, Sarah's mind was already working on multiple levels, analyzing the information she'd received, planning her approach to accessing Marcus's files, and developing strategies for becoming indispensable without becoming trapped. She was no longer the broken woman who'd been sold to settle her husband's debts. She was a survivor with a mission, armed with dangerous knowledge and motivated by the memory of women who died because they hadn't been warned in time. The game with Marcus Thornfield was about to become far more complicated than he could have imagined. Sarah Henderson was done being prey. It was time to discover if she could become a predator herself. That evening, as Sarah sat in her elegant prison reading one of the carefully selected books from her shelf, she began planning her first move in what would either be a brilliant escape or a deadly mistake. The copy of Jane Eyre in her hands seemed oddly appropriate, Another story of a woman trapped by circumstances beyond her control, fighting for agency in a world determined to reduce her to a mere ornament. But unlike Charlotte Bronte's heroine, Sarah had advantages that might tip the scales in her favor. She had medical training, access to vulnerable guests who might prove useful, and most importantly, she had been warned about the dangers in time to prepare for them. Marcus Thornfield had made a critical error in judgment. He'd assumed that acquiring a woman discarded for her inability to bear children meant he was getting damaged goods. Instead, he'd brought into his carefully controlled environment someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight. For the hunt was about to begin, but Marcus Thornfield was no longer the only predator in the house. Sarah's opportunity to prove her worth came sooner than expected, arriving in the form of a medical emergency that would test everything she'd learned about survival in Marcus Thornfield's twisted world. It was her 6th night at the estate when urgent voices in the corridor outside her suite jolted her from uneasy sleep. Through her door, she could hear Marcus speaking in clipped, angry tones to someone whose responses were too quiet to understand. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed twice, an unusual time for business conversations, even for a man whose affairs seemed to operate outside normal social boundaries. Sarah pressed her ear to the door, catching fragments of conversation. That made her blood run cold, completely botched, bleeding won't stop. Can't take him to a hospital. Too many questions. A medical emergency involving someone who couldn't receive conventional care. Sarah realized this might be her first test, and possibly her only chance to prove herself indispensable before Marcus decided she was more liability than asset. She dressed quickly in one of the conservative outfits from her wardrobe, choosing dark colors that wouldn't show blood, then waited by her door for the inevitable summons. It came within minutes, a sharp knock followed by Mrs. Carmichael's urgent whisper. "Miss Henderson, Mr. Thornfield requires your immediate assistance. There's been an accident." Sarah opened the door to find the housekeeper pale with stress, her usually perfect composure cracked by whatever crisis was unfolding. Behind her stood Marcus, still in evening wear but disheveled in a way that suggested the night's events had spiraled beyond his control. "I hope your nursing skills are as current as you claimed," Marcus said without preamble. "I have a guest who requires discreet medical attention. The situation is complicated." Sarah followed them down corridors she'd never seen before, past hidden doorways that revealed the estate's true complexity. The house wasn't just a mansion. It was a facility designed for concealment, with separate quarters, private entrances, and soundproofed rooms that could hide whatever activities Marcus's guests required. They descended a narrow staircase to what must have been the original basement, now converted into a sophisticated medical facility that rivaled many hospital emergency rooms. The equipment was state-of-the-art, the supplies comprehensive, and the setup clearly designed by someone with extensive medical knowledge. On the examination table lay a man in his 50s, unconscious and bleeding from what appeared to be a gunshot wound to his shoulder. His expensive suit was cut away to reveal the injury, but whoever had attempted initial treatment had made critical errors that were now threatening his life. Sarah's nursing instincts took over immediately, pushing aside all thoughts of her own precarious situation. This was a human being in crisis, and her training demanded she act to save his life regardless of the circumstances that had brought him here. "Who attempted the initial treatment?" she asked, moving to examine the wound, while mentally cataloguing the supplies she would need. "Dr. Stevens," Marcus replied, gesturing to an elderly man who sat slumped in a corner chair, his hands shaking with what might have been alcohol withdrawal or simply terror. "He's been my consulting physician for several years, but age has apparently affected his competence." Sarah assessed the botched surgery with growing anger. Whoever Dr. Stevens was, his attempt to remove the bullet had caused more damage than the original wound. Arterial bleeding had been inadequately controlled, debris had been left in the wound tract, and infection was already setting in from contaminated instruments. "This man needs immediate surgery," Sarah said, turning to face Marcus directly. "Proper surgery, performed under sterile conditions with adequate support. What you've got here is a dying man whose life depends on the next few hours." Marcus studied her with calculating intensity. "Can you save him?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I can try, but I'll need complete autonomy over the medical decisions, access to all necessary supplies, and assistance from staff who will follow my orders without question." For a moment, the balance of power in the room shifted. Marcus Thornfield was accustomed to controlling every aspect of his domain, but medical emergencies didn't respect social hierarchies. If he wanted his guest to survive, he would have to trust Sarah's expertise completely. "What do you need?" he asked finally. Sarah turned back to the patient, her mind already organizing the complex procedure ahead. "First, get Dr. Stevens out of here. He's more liability than help at this point. I need Mrs. Carmichael to assist me. She strikes me as someone who can follow instructions precisely under pressure, and I need you to stay out of my way unless I specifically request something." The dismissal of Marcus from his own domain was audacious, but Sarah had calculated correctly that his desperation to save his guest would override his need for control. He nodded curtly and moved to escort the trembling Dr. Stevens from the room. As the basement medical facility transformed into an operating theatre, Sarah discovered that her months of failed fertility treatments had inadvertently prepared her for this moment. She'd observed countless procedures, learned to manage medical equipment, and developed the kind of steady nerves that came from enduring repeated disappointments with grace. Mrs. Carmichael proved to be an excellent surgical assistant, anticipating Sarah's needs and maintaining the sterile field with military precision. The housekeeper had clearly assisted with medical procedures before, another piece of evidence that emergencies like this were routine occurrences at the Thornfield estate. The surgery took 4 hours. Sarah worked with the focused intensity she'd learned during her nursing training, every movement calculated to maximize the patient's chances of survival. She removed bullet fragments, repaired arterial damage, and cleaned contaminated tissue with the thoroughness of someone who understood that a single mistake could mean death. As dawn light began filtering through the basement windows, Sarah finally stepped back from the table. The patient's vital signs were stable, the bleeding was controlled, and barring complications, he would survive. "Remarkable," Marcus said from the corner where he'd been silently observing. "Dr. Stevens assured me the situation was hopeless, that we should focus on disposal rather than treatment." Sarah felt a chill at his casual mention of disposal, understanding that she'd just witnessed how Marcus dealt with inconvenient problems. If she'd failed to save the patient, she might have found herself facing disposal as well. "He'll need in careful monitoring for the next 48 hours, Sarah said, stripping off her surgical gloves with professional detachment. "Infection is still a risk, and there could be complications from the blood loss. But if he follows proper recovery protocols, he should make a full recovery." Marcus nodded, his expression revealing nothing of what he was thinking. "And the discretion required for this incident?" "Complete," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Patient confidentiality is fundamental to medical practice. Whatever brought this man here, whoever he is, and whatever happened to him, none of that is my concern. My only responsibility was treating his injuries." It was the answer Marcus had wanted to hear, but Sarah meant every word. Her nursing ethics wouldn't allow her to betray a patient's trust, regardless of the circumstances surrounding his care. That commitment to professional standards might be one of the few moral anchors she could maintain in the morally ambiguous world she'd entered. Over the following days, as Sarah monitored the patient's recovery, she began to understand the true scope of Marcus Thornfield's operations. The injured man turned out to be a federal judge whose gambling debts had made him vulnerable to blackmail. His accident had occurred during a confrontation with loan sharks who wanted to send a message about timely payments. Marcus had intervened not out of kindness, but because Judge Harrison's cooperation was essential for several ongoing legal matters that required favorable rulings. The judge's death would have complicated Marcus's business interests significantly, making his survival worth the risk of bringing medical attention to the estate. "You've proven quite valuable," Marcus told Sarah during one of their morning breakfasts, his tone carrying new respect mixed with calculation. "Judge Harrison speaks very highly of your professionalism. He's recommended your services to several colleagues who occasionally require discreet medical attention." Sarah realized she was being offered a devil's bargain. Her successful treatment of the judge had opened doors to a broader network of powerful men whose illegal activities required medical support outside official channels. Marcus was essentially offering her a career as a criminal physician, trading her healing skills for protection and luxury. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked carefully. "A partnership of sorts. You would provide medical services for my associates when needed, in exchange for a very comfortable life here at the estate. No more talk of this being a temporary arrangement. You would become a permanent resident with significant autonomy and resources." The offer was seductive in its own way. Sarah would have purpose again, using her medical skills in challenging situations that would test her abilities. She would have security, luxury, and the kind of professional respect she'd never experienced. During her marriage, all she had to do was abandon her ethics and become complicit in activities that probably included everything from political corruption to organized crime. "And if I decline?" she asked. Marcus's smile was cold and predatory. "Why would you decline? You have no family, no home to return to, no prospects for employment that would utilize your unique qualifications. Here, you would be valued, respected, essential. What alternative could possibly compare?" The implication was clear. Sarah could accept the role of criminal physician willingly, or she could join Emily Patterson and the other women who'd become inconvenient. There was no third option, at least none that Marcus was willing to acknowledge. "I need time to consider the implications," Sarah said finally. "Of course, such an important decision shouldn't be rushed." Marcus stood from the breakfast table, his manner suggesting the conversation was concluded. "Take all the time you need, but remember, opportunities like this don't remain available indefinitely." As Marcus left for his office, Sarah remained at the table, staring out at the formal gardens where Emily Patterson had once walked. She was being offered everything she'd never had in her marriage: professional respect, financial security, and the chance to use her medical skills in ways that would challenge and fulfill her. The price was only her soul. That afternoon, while Marcus conducted business calls in his office, Sarah made a decision that would determine not just her survival, but the kind of person she would become in this new life. She began documenting everything she'd learned about the estate's operations, creating detailed notes about the medical facility, the injured judge, and the network of corruption Marcus had revealed. Mrs. Carmichael found her in the library, writing in a journal she'd requested from the estate's supplies. "Dangerous habit," the housekeeper observed quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't being observed. "Everything about this place is dangerous," Sarah replied, "but I'd rather face danger on my own terms than live as a comfortable prisoner." Mrs. Carmichael studied Sarah's face with new interest. "You're planning something." "I'm planning to survive," Sarah corrected, "but survival on my terms, not his." The Housekeeper was quiet for a long moment, then sat down across from Sarah with the careful movements of someone making a significant decision. "If you're serious about taking control of your situation," she said quietly, "there are things you should know about the estate's other residents. Women who found ways to carve out space for themselves without directly challenging Mr. Thornfield's authority." Sarah looked up from her journal, sensing that Mrs. Carmichael was about to reveal secrets that could change everything about her understanding of the estate and her options for survival. "Tell me," she said simply. Mrs. Carmichael glanced toward the library door one more time, then began speaking in urgent whispers about women who'd learned to play Marcus Thornfield's game better than he'd ever suspected, and the underground network they'd created to protect each other from his worst impulses. Sarah realized she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. The question was whether she was strong enough to become part of a resistance that operated in shadows, or whether she would end up as another cautionary tale for the next woman who found herself trapped in Marcus Thornfield's beautiful, deadly web. Mrs. Carmichael's revelations about other women at the estate began with a story that changed everything Sarah thought she understood about her situation. As they sat in the library's afternoon shadows, the housekeeper spoke in whispers about a woman named Catherine Walsh, who had arrived at the estate 5 years earlier under circumstances remarkably similar to Sarah's own. Catherine was a lawyer, Mrs. Carmichael explained, her eyes constantly monitoring the doorway. Her husband had embezzled money from his firm's client accounts to pay gambling debts. When the theft was discovered, he made a deal with prosecutors, his wife's legal expertise, in exchange for a reduced sentence. Mr. Thornfield facilitated the arrangement. Sarah felt a familiar chill of recognition. Another woman traded like property to settle a man's financial obligations. Another life reduced to its utility value. What happened to her? "She's still here," Mrs. Carmichael said quietly, "but not as a prisoner. Catherine found a way to make herself so valuable to Mr. Thornfield's operations that eliminating her became impossible. She manages the legal aspects of his business empire, handles contracts and negotiations that require absolute discretion. More importantly, she's built a network of protection that extends far beyond this estate." The implications struck Sarah like lightning. Not every woman who came to the estate met Emily Patterson's fate. Some found ways to survive, even thrive, by becoming indispensable rather than compliant. "Where is Catherine now?" Sarah asked. Mrs. Carmichael checked her watch with practiced efficiency. "She maintains offices in Burlington, officially as an independent legal consultant specializing in complex business transactions, but she returns to the estate regularly for consultations with Mr. Thornfield's associates. In fact, she should be arriving this evening to review contracts related to Judge Harrison's cooperation." Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. A lawyer who understood Marcus Thornfield's operations from the inside could provide exactly the kind of strategic guidance Sarah needed. But approaching Catherine would require careful planning. Any misstep could expose Sarah's intentions and trigger the kind of accident that had claimed Emily's life. "How do I contact her without arousing suspicion?" Mrs. Carmichael smiled for the first time since Sarah had known her, the expression transforming her stern features into something almost maternal. "Catherine has been asking about you since Judge Harrison mentioned your medical skills. She's particularly interested in meeting the woman who performed emergency surgery without asking inconvenient questions about the patient's injuries." That evening, Sarah was invited to join Marcus for dinner in the main dining room for the first time since her arrival. The formal setting was clearly intended to impress: crystal stemware, silver service, and candles that cast flattering light across. Antique furnishings that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. Marcus appeared in evening wear that emphasized his distinguished appearance while concealing the predatory nature that lurked beneath his cultured exterior. He was playing the role of gracious host, but Sarah had learned to recognize the calculation. Behind his every gesture, I thought it appropriate to celebrate your successful integration into our household, he said, pulling out her chair with theatrical courtesy. Judge Harrison has recovered remarkably well, thanks to your expertise. He's already recommended your services to several colleagues who occasionally require discreet medical attention. Sarah accepted the compliment while studying Marcus's expression for signs of what he really wanted from this conversation. Nothing in this house happened by accident. Every interaction served his purposes in ways that weren't immediately obvious. I'm glad I could help, she replied carefully. It felt good to use my medical training again, to remember why I became a nurse in the first place. Marcus poured wine that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly salary during her marriage, his movements deliberate and controlled. Speaking of your integration, I've arranged for you to meet one of my most trusted associates this evening. Catherine Walsh handles the legal complexities of my business operations. I thought you might find her inspiring. The word choice was deliberate. Marcus was presenting Catherine as a role model, an example of how women could thrive within his organization by embracing their designated functions. But Sarah heard something else in his tone, a warning that Catherine represented both opportunity and danger, depending on how their meeting progressed. Dinner proceeded with the kind of sophisticated conversation that felt like a performance for an invisible audience. Marcus discussed current events, asked about Sarah's impressions of Vermont, and shared carefully edited stories about the estate's history. He was charming, intelligent, and utterly terrifying in his ability to present evil as elegance. Catherine Walsh arrived as they were finishing the main course, and Sarah immediately understood why she'd survived in Marcus Thornfield's world for 5 years. The woman who entered the dining room carried herself with the confident authority of someone who'd learned to navigate treacherous waters without losing her essential self. Catherine was perhaps 40, with silver-streaked auburn hair pulled back in a style that was professional, but not severe. Her clothing was expensive but understated, chosen to project competence rather than beauty. Most importantly, her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who missed nothing and forgot even less. "Marcus, good evening," Catherine said, accepting, his kiss on both cheeks with practiced ease. "I trust Judge Harrison is recovering well from his accident." "Remarkably well, thanks to our new resident physician," Marcus replied, gesturing toward Sarah. "Catherine Walsh, I'd like you to meet Sarah Henderson. Sarah, Catherine handles the legal aspects of my business interests." Catherine extended her hand with a grip that was firm without being challenging. "I've heard excellent things about your medical skills, Sarah. It's refreshing to meet another professional woman who understands the importance of discretion in sensitive situations." The words seemed innocuous, but Sarah detected layers of meaning that suggested Catherine was communicating. On multiple levels, this wasn't just a polite introduction. It was the beginning of an evaluation that would determine whether Sarah could be trusted with dangerous secrets. As they moved to the library for coffee and conversation, Sarah found herself studying Catherine's interaction with Marcus. The relationship was clearly built on mutual respect rather than dominance and submission. Catherine offered opinions, challenged assumptions, and maintained her own agenda in ways that would have been unthinkable for Emily Patterson or the other women who'd been broken by their circumstances. "Sarah was just telling me how much she's enjoyed returning to medical practice," Marcus said, settling into his usual chair with the territorial confidence of a man in his own domain. "I think she's beginning to appreciate the unique opportunities available here." Catherine's response was measured but pointed. Opportunities are valuable only when they align with one's professional goals. What are your long-term objectives, Sarah? Where do you see your medical career developing over the next few years? The question was clearly a test, designed to reveal whether Sarah was thinking strategically about her situation or simply reacting to immediate pressures. Sarah had prepared for this moment since learning about Catherine's existence. I'm interested in expanding my expertise beyond traditional nursing, she said carefully. Emergency medicine, trauma surgery, perhaps specializing in situations where conventional medical resources aren't available. There seems to be significant demand for those skills among certain populations. Catherine nodded approvingly. Demand that's only increasing as conventional healthcare becomes more regulated and monitored. Independent practitioners who can work outside official channels are becoming quite valuable. Marcus smiled with satisfaction, clearly pleased that his two female assets were discussing ways to enhance their utility to his operations. But Sarah noticed that Catherine's comments contained subtle warnings about the dangers of working outside official channels, risks that extended far beyond medical malpractice. As the evening progressed, Catherine maneuvered the conversation toward topics that revealed the scope of Marcus's business empire. Real estate development that skirted environmental regulations, political contributions that influenced judicial appointments, financial arrangements that moved money through, networks designed to avoid federal oversight. Each revelation was presented as normal business practice, but Sarah understood she was receiving a comprehensive education in criminal enterprise. The key to success in any complex business environment, Catherine explained, is understanding that traditional rules often conflict with practical necessities. Successful professionals learn to navigate between legal requirements and operational realities. The euphemisms were elegant, but the message was clear. Survival required becoming, complicit in illegal activities while maintaining plausible deniability. Catherine had thrived by becoming indispensable to Marcus's criminal empire, but the price was her professional ethics, and possibly her soul. When Marcus excused himself to take a business call, Catherine's demeanor shifted subtly. The polished, professional mask remained, but her eyes conveyed urgency that hadn't been present during their public conversation. "Walk with me in the garden," she suggested casually. The night air might be refreshing after such an intense discussion. Outside, surrounded by formal landscaping that provided both beauty and acoustic cover, Catherine finally spoke freely. "You're asking the right questions, but you're not asking them safely. Marcus is more perceptive than most people realize, and he's been watching your behavior very carefully since the judge's surgery." Sarah felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. "What do you mean?" "I mean you're displaying exactly the kind of independence that got Emily Patterson killed," Catherine said bluntly. "You're thinking like someone planning an escape rather than someone accepting a new life. That kind of thinking is visible to anyone who knows what to look for." The warning hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd thought she was being subtle in her resistance, but apparently her intentions were more transparent than she'd realized. "What should I be doing differently?" Catherine stopped walking and faced Sarah directly. "You should be thinking about transformation rather than escape. The women who survive in Marcus's world are those who become genuinely valuable rather than simply compliant. Emily tried to maintain her old identity while pretending to accept her circumstances. It didn't work. What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting you have medical skills that could make you absolutely essential to an operation much larger than this estate. Marcus facilitates activities for people whose power depends on absolute secrecy. Politicians, judges, business leaders, who need medical care that can't appear in official records. If you became the regional expert in discreet medical services, you'd have protection that extends far beyond Marcus's direct control. Sarah began to understand the scope of what Catherine was proposing. Instead of fighting against her circumstances, she could leverage them to build an independent power base. Her infertility, which had made her worthless as a traditional wife, could become an asset in a world where childless women were less vulnerable to certain types of pressure. And the ethical considerations? Catherine's laugh was bitter but not unkind. Ethics are luxuries for people with choices. You can maintain your moral purity and end up like Emily, or you can adapt to survive and fight for something better from a position of strength. As they completed their circuit of the garden, Sarah realized she was being offered membership in a different kind of resistance, one that operated by appearing to collaborate while building independent power. It was morally ambiguous, professionally risky, and potentially the only path to genuine freedom. "Think about what I've said," Catherine concluded as they returned to the house. "But don't think too long. Marcus has already begun making plans for your future, and his patience with uncertainty is limited." That night, as Sarah lay in her elegant prison staring at the ceiling, she faced the most important decision of her life. She could maintain her moral principles and likely die for them, or she could compromise her ethics to survive and potentially save other women from the same fate. The choice would define not just her future, but the kind of person she would become in a world where traditional morality was a fatal weakness. Sarah Henderson was about to discover whether she had the strength to become someone she'd never imagined possible. A woman who could play by evil rules while maintaining enough of her essential self to eventually destroy the system from within. The transformation was beginning, and there would be no going back. Sarah's transformation from reluctant captive to strategic player began with a phone call that arrived at 3 a.m, jolting her from restless sleep with the urgency that only medical emergencies could generate. Mrs. Carmichael's voice through the intercom was tight with controlled panic. "Miss Henderson, your immediate assistance is required. We have multiple casualties arriving within the hour." Multiple casualties. Sarah's nursing training kicked in automatically as she dressed in surgical scrubs that had been delivered to her suite sometime during the night, evidence that Marcus had been planning this test long before the emergency actually occurred. Everything about her situation was orchestrated, from the medical crises to her responses, all part of a larger design she was only beginning to understand. The basement medical facility had been transformed into a field hospital, with additional equipment that hadn't been present during Judge Harrison's surgery. Sarah realized that the estate's medical capabilities were far more extensive than she'd initially observed. This wasn't just a convenience for treating occasional injuries, but a fully equipped trauma center designed to handle mass casualties, without any connection to official medical systems. 3 men were carried in by a team of operatives who moved with military precision, their faces covered and their communication limited to essential tactical information. The injuries were severe: gunshot wounds, knife trauma, and what appeared to be burns from an explosion. All 3 victims wore expensive clothing beneath their medical trauma, suggesting they were high-value targets rather than street criminals. "What happened?" Sarah asked Marcus as she began triaging the patients according to the severity of their injuries. "A business negotiation that became complicated," Marcus replied, his tone suggesting that details were neither available nor advisable to pursue. "Can you save them?" Sarah assessed the situation with the cold calculation she'd learned during her nursing training. The first patient had suffered massive abdominal trauma that would require immediate surgery to prevent him from bleeding out. The second had burns covering 30% of his body, requiring specialized care that would test the limits of the basement facility's capabilities. The third appeared to have a traumatic brain injury that might be beyond treatment regardless of available resources. "I can try," she said, "but I'll need help, professional help from someone with surgical experience." Marcus gestured toward a woman Sarah hadn't noticed entering the facility, a slight, dark-haired figure in surgical scrubs who moved with the confident efficiency of someone accustomed to trauma surgery. As she approached, Sarah realized this was Dr. Elena Rodriguez, another woman whose professional expertise had made her valuable enough to survive in Marcus's world. "Dr. Rodriguez specializes in emergency surgery," Marcus explained. "She's been consulting with our organization for 2 years, ever since her medical license was suspended for performing procedures outside approved protocols." Elena nodded to Sarah with professional courtesy tinged by wariness. "I understand you handled the judge's surgery alone. Impressive work for someone without surgical training." The compliment contained an implicit challenge. Elena was establishing her superior credentials while assessing whether Sarah would be a competent assistant or a dangerous liability. Sarah recognized the dynamic immediately. She'd seen it in hospital settings, where experienced doctors tested new nurses to determine their reliability under pressure. "I had good instruction during my nursing training," Sarah replied carefully. "And emergency situations tend to clarify priorities pretty quickly." Elena smiled approvingly. "True. Let's see how well you handle multiple priorities simultaneously." The next 6 hours tested every skill Sarah had acquired during her medical career and several she'd never imagined needing. Under Elena's direction, she performed procedures that pushed far beyond the scope of traditional nursing, taking on responsibilities that would have required years of additional training in conventional medical settings. The first patient required emergency surgery to repair arterial damage and remove bullet fragments from his abdominal cavity. Sarah found herself functioning as Elena's primary surgical assistant, anticipating needs and managing complications with the kind of intuitive understanding that usually took years to develop. The second patient's burns required specialized treatment that pushed the basement facility's capabilities to their limits. Elena had Sarah managing pain medication, monitoring for infection, and performing wound care that would have challenged experienced burn specialists in major hospitals. The third patient's brain injury proved beyond their ability to treat, despite efforts that continued until dawn. His death was handled with the same efficient discretion that characterized everything else about the estate's operations. The body disappeared while Sarah and Elena were focused on stabilizing their surviving patients. As morning light filtered through the basement windows, Sarah realized she'd crossed a professional threshold that could never be reversed. She'd performed medical procedures far beyond her official qualifications on patients whose injuries were almost certainly the result of criminal activities, in a facility that operated completely outside legal medical oversight. "Excellent work," Elena said, as they completed their final patient assessments. "You have natural surgical instincts. With proper training, you could develop into quite a capable trauma surgeon." The offer was implicit but clear. Elena was suggesting Sarah could join the network of medical professionals who provided services that conventional healthcare systems couldn't or wouldn't offer. It was a path to genuine professional advancement, but one that required abandoning any pretense of legal or ethical compliance. "What kind of training?" Sarah asked, testing the boundaries of Elena's offer. "Private instruction in surgical techniques, pharmaceutical management, and emergency procedures. The kind of education that's not available through conventional medical schools because it focuses on practical applications rather than theoretical compliance." Marcus appeared as they were, leaning up the surgical area, his expression revealing satisfaction with the night's events. Sarah realized she'd passed another test, proving her value not just as a basic medical provider, but as someone capable of handling the complex trauma cases that were apparently routine occurrences in his organization. Dr. Rodriguez has recommended you for advanced training, Marcus said without preamble. She believes you have the potential to become quite valuable to our expanding operations. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of being evaluated and categorized, her human worth reduced to her utility in Marcus's criminal enterprise. But she also recognized an opportunity to gain skills and knowledge that could eventually become weapons. In her own fight for freedom, what would this training involve, she asked. Elena answered before Marcus could respond. 6 months of intensive instruction in trauma surgery, forensic medicine, and pharmaceutical chemistry. You'd learn to treat injuries without leaving evidence, manage pain and compliance through chemical means, and perform procedures that address various business needs. The euphemisms were chilling in their implications. Sarah was being offered training not just in healing, but in torture, chemical control, and probably murder disguised as medical care. She would become a doctor in the most literal sense, someone with the power of life and death over human beings. The training would take place here at the estate, Marcus added. Dr. Rodriguez maintains a private medical school of sorts, educating select students in specialized applications of medical knowledge. Graduation would establish you as one of the most valuable medical consultants in our region. Sarah understood that she was being offered a devil's bargain wrapped in professional advancement. The training would give her capabilities that went far beyond traditional medicine, making her extraordinarily valuable, but also complicit in activities that violated every ethical principle she'd ever held. I need time to consider the implications, she said carefully. Of course, Marcus replied, but his tone suggested that prolonged consideration would not be tolerated. Dr. Rodriguez will be staying at the estate for the next week to monitor our patient's recovery. Perhaps you could discuss the curriculum with her, better understand what opportunities await. As Marcus left to attend to other business, Elena remained in the medical facility with Sarah, ostensibly to complete patient documentation, but clearly to continue their conversation without Marcus's direct oversight. He's offering you something extraordinary, Elena said quietly, checking the vital signs of their surviving patients. The kind of medical education that money usually can't buy, regardless of price. What's the real cost? Sarah asked bluntly. Elena paused in her work, considering how much truth to reveal. Everything you used to be. The woman who enters my training program won't be the same person who emerges. You'll have capabilities that put you beyond conventional morality, beyond traditional legal constraints. You'll be able to save lives in ways that hospitals can't imagine, but you'll also be able to end lives with equal efficiency. The honesty was brutal but appreciated. Eleanor was offering Sarah a clear-eyed assessment of what the transformation would entail without the seductive euphemisms that Marcus used to disguise the moral costs of his offers. And if I decline, then you remain a skilled nurse in a world that's rapidly becoming too dangerous for skilled nurses to survive. Marcus doesn't keep people who can't grow into greater usefulness. Stagnation here is fatal. Sarah spent the rest of the day observing Elena's work with their recovering patients, noting the older woman's extraordinary competence and the casual way she wielded medical knowledge that bordered on the supernatural. Elena could diagnose conditions at a glance, predict complications before symptoms appeared, and manage pain or consciousness with pharmaceutical precision that suggested years of experience treating patients whose cooperation couldn't be assumed. Where did you learn these techniques? Sarah asked during one of their brief breaks. Military medicine initially, Eleanor replied. then private consulting for clients who required creative approaches to medical challenges. Some techniques I developed through necessity when conventional treatments weren't sufficient for the situations I encountered. Sarah realized she was looking at her potential future, a woman whose medical abilities had evolved far beyond traditional healing into something that encompassed the full spectrum of human physiological manipulation. Elena could save or destroy with equal competence, making her invaluable to people whose activities required absolute medical discretion. That evening, as Sarah sat in her suite reviewing everything she'd learned during the crisis, she faced the most consequential decision of her life. Elena's training would transform her into someone with extraordinary capabilities, but those capabilities would be forever linked to criminal activities that violated everything she'd once believed about the purpose of medical knowledge. Yet, the alternative was to remain static in a world that punished stagnation with death. Emily Patterson had tried to maintain her original identity and died for it. Catherine Walsh had embraced transformation and built independent power. Elena Rodriguez had pushed beyond conventional medicine and achieved a kind of terrible freedom. Sarah realized that her infertility, which had made her worthless as a traditional wife, might actually be an advantage in this new world. She had no children to be threatened, no family connections to be leveraged against her. Her previous life had been completely severed, leaving her free to become someone entirely new. The question was whether she had the strength to become a monster in order to eventually destroy the monsters who had created her circumstances. Elena's training would give her tools for survival and possibly victory, but using those tools would require sacrificing the person she'd always believed herself to be. As midnight approached and the estate settled into its watchful quiet, Sarah made a decision that would echo through every remaining day of her life. She would accept Elena's training and Marcus's offer, not because she embraced their vision of her future, but because she understood that defeating evil sometimes required learning to speak its language fluently. The transformation would be total, but Sarah had finally realized that total transformation might be the only path to genuine freedom. She would become the weapon Marcus thought he was creating, but she would choose her own targets when the time came to use it. The education in darkness was about to begin, and Sarah Henderson was ready to learn whatever lessons would make her strong enough to eventually destroy her teachers. Sarah's education in darkness began at dawn 3 days later, when Elena Rodriguez led her into a section of the estate she'd never seen before, a converted wine cellar that had been transformed into something that looked like a cross between a medical laboratory and a medieval torture chamber. The stone walls were lined with equipment that Sarah recognized from hospital settings, alongside instruments whose purposes she could only guess at with growing horror. "Welcome to your real education," Elena said, her voice carrying none of the warmth Sarah had glimpsed during their life-saving surgery. In this sterile environment, Elena revealed herself as someone who had moved so far beyond conventional medical ethics that healing and harming had become merely different applications of the same fundamental knowledge. The first lesson involved pharmacology that was never taught in nursing school, compounds that could induce compliance without leaving traces, substances that could simulate natural death, and chemicals that could enhance or diminish cognitive function with surgical precision. Elena demonstrated each drug's effects using test subjects that Sarah realized with sick certainty were probably prisoners from Marcus's other operations. "The key principle," Elena explained, while showing Sarah how to calculate dosages for maximum effect without detection, is understanding that the human body is simply a chemical system. Once you master the chemistry, you can manipulate any physiological or psychological state with the right compounds. Sarah forced herself to take notes, to ask clinical questions, to participate in discussions that treated human suffering as an intellectual exercise. Each lesson required her to push further away from the person she'd been, to embrace knowledge that could never be unknown or unused ethically. The pharmaceutical training was followed by surgical techniques that bore no resemblance to the healing procedures Sarah had learned during her nursing education. Elena taught her how to inflict precise damage that would appear accidental, how to perform operations that would leave patients permanently dependent on their captors, and how to extract information through carefully applied medical torture that left no visible marks. Traditional medicine is limited by the requirement to heal, Elena observed during a particularly disturbing lesson on nerve manipulation. Once you abandon that limitation, your capabilities become exponentially greater. You can save lives that hospitals would consider hopeless, but you can also end lives that seem perfectly healthy. The most challenging aspect of Sarah's education wasn't learning the techniques. Her nursing background had given her a solid foundation in anatomy and physiology that Elena's instruction built upon with terrifying efficiency. The real challenge was compartmentalizing the moral implications of what she was learning, finding ways to acquire skills that violated everything she'd once believed about the purpose of medical knowledge. Sarah discovered that her infertility, which had made her worthless in her marriage, actually provided psychological armor in this new environment. She had no maternal instincts to be triggered by Elena's casual discussion of harming children, no family connections to make her vulnerable to emotional manipulation. Her perceived barrenness had become a form of protection that allowed her to learn things that would have broken someone with more conventional emotional attachments. After 2 weeks of intensive training, Elena introduced Sarah to the estate's most closely guarded secret, a network of medical professionals who provided services to criminal organizations across the northeastern United States. The network included doctors who had lost their licenses for ethical violations, nurses who had been blackmailed into cooperation, and medical researchers who conducted human experiments that would have been impossible in conventional laboratory settings. "We call ourselves the Underground Hippocratic Society," Eleanor explained with bitter irony during one of their evening debriefings. "We've taken the original oath to its logical extreme. First, do no harm to the people who pay us. Everyone else is fair game." Sarah was introduced to other members through encrypted video conferences that revealed the scope of medical corruption Elena was offering her access to. Dr. Michael Chen performed experimental surgeries on unwilling subjects in a facility disguised as a private clinic in Boston. Dr. Rebecca Martinez specialized in psychological manipulation through chemical means, helping wealthy clients control family members and business partners. Dr. James Wright had perfected techniques for extracting information through medical torture that left no physical evidence. Each introduction revealed new depths to the criminal medical network Sarah was being invited to join. These weren't desperate people forced into terrible choices. They were professionals who had embraced the power that came from abandoning ethical constraints, who found purpose and satisfaction in wielding life and death authority without oversight or limitation. "The question," Elena said after Sarah had met the core network members, "is whether you're ready to take your final examination. Success would establish you as a full member of our society, with all the protections and opportunities that membership provides." Sarah had been dreading this moment since her training began. She knew that Eleanor's final examination would require her to demonstrate her willingness to use her newly acquired skills on a living human being, to cross the line from learning about medical torture to actually performing it. "What does the examination involve?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Elena's smile was coldly professional. Mr. Thornfield has a prisoner who possesses information valuable to his business operations. Traditional interrogation methods have proved insufficient. Your examination will be to extract that information using the pharmaceutical and surgical techniques you've learned, while ensuring the subject survives to provide additional intelligence if needed. The prisoner turned out to be a young man named David Fleming, perhaps 25 years old, who had made the mistake of trying to blackmail one of Marcus's political allies with evidence of corruption. David had been held in a hidden section of the estate's basement for 3 weeks, his physical condition deteriorating under psychological pressure designed to break his resistance. When Sarah first saw David strapped to the medical table in Elena's laboratory, she felt a surge of protective instinct that threatened to overwhelm the clinical detachment she'd been carefully cultivating. He looked like he could have been her younger brother, with innocent features that suggested he'd never imagined the kind of evil he'd stumbled into by trying to expose political corruption. The subject has been resistant to conventional interrogation, Elena explained, consulting a file that detailed David's capture and the information Marcus needed to extract. He has evidence of illegal campaign contributions that could compromise several of Mr. Thornfield's political assets. Your task is to obtain the location of that evidence and any copies he may have created. Sarah studied David's medical chart, noting the signs of malnutrition and psychological stress that indicated he'd been systematically weakened to make him more vulnerable to the chemical manipulation she was expected to perform. Elena had calculated exactly how much abuse his system could tolerate before permanent damage occurred. "What happens to him after I extract the information?" Sarah asked. "That depends on the quality of intelligence you obtain and Mr. Thornfield's assessment of ongoing security risks," Elena replied with clinical detachment. "Your responsibility is extraction, not disposition." Sarah realized this was the moment that would define the rest of her life. She could refuse to participate and almost certainly face the same fate as Emily Patterson, or she could perform medical torture on an innocent young man and become fully complicit in Marcus Thornfield's criminal empire. But as she prepared the pharmaceutical compounds Elena had taught her to synthesize, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She would perform the examination, but not in the way Elena expected. Instead of using her newfound knowledge to break David Fleming, she would find a way to save him while appearing to comply with Marcus's demands. The plan that formed in Sarah's mind was extraordinarily risky and would require perfect execution to avoid detection. She would use her pharmaceutical knowledge to simulate the effects of successful interrogation, while actually protecting David from the worst aspects of the torture she was supposed to inflict. "Are you ready to begin?" Elena asked, her tone suggesting that any hesitation would be interpreted as weakness, requiring correction. Sarah nodded, moving toward the medical table where David Fleming lay unconscious from the sedatives Elena had administered. As she began preparing the injection that would either break or save him, she whispered a prayer to whatever forces might protect the innocent in a world where healing had been perverted into harm. The examination began with Sarah administering a compound that was supposed to lower David's psychological defenses while keeping him conscious enough to respond to questions. But the injection she actually gave him was a carefully calculated mixture that would simulate compliance while protecting his cognitive function from permanent damage. "Excellent technique," Elena observed, as David's apparent responsiveness increased. "Now begin the extraction protocol. Start with general questions about his investigation methods, then move to specifics about evidence location." Sarah asked the questions Elena expected, but the answers David provided were actually responses to completely different inquiries. She whispered, while appearing to follow the interrogation script. To Elena's observation, it looked like successful information extraction. In reality, Sarah was conducting a conversation that revealed David's situation while protecting the actual intelligence Marcus wanted. The deception required split-second timing and perfect coordination between Sarah's spoken questions and her whispered instructions. David, despite his weakened condition, proved intelligent enough to understand the game Sarah was playing and responded with information that sounded valuable while actually revealing nothing that could harm the political figures he'd been investigating. After 2 hours of simulated interrogation, Sarah had obtained what appeared to be complete intelligence about David's evidence collection, while actually learning nothing that Marcus could use to harm anyone. Elena was impressed by the apparent success, praising Sarah's technique and noting how effectively she'd broken the subject's resistance. "Outstanding work," Elena said as they completed the session. "You've demonstrated mastery of advanced interrogation pharmaceuticals and shown excellent intuition about psychological manipulation. Mr. Thornfield will be very pleased with the intelligence you've extracted." Sarah had passed her examination, but not in the way Elena believed. She'd proven her capability to perform medical torture while actually subverting the process to protect the victim. The deception established her credibility within Marcus's organization while preserving her essential humanity. As David was removed to a holding cell to await Marcus's decision about his fate, Sarah realized she'd crossed a different threshold than anyone expected. She hadn't become complicit in evil. She'd learned to impersonate evil so convincingly that even experts couldn't detect the difference. The education Elena had provided was indeed transformative, but not in the way Marcus Thornfield had intended. Sarah had acquired extraordinary capabilities that she could use to protect the innocent while appearing to serve the guilty. Her infertility, which had made her worthless as a traditional wife, had freed her to become something far more powerful, a guardian angel disguised as a demon. The real game was about to begin, and Sarah Henderson finally had the tools she needed to win it. 3 months after Sarah's apparent transformation into Marcus Thornfield's most valuable asset, she received an assignment that would test everything. She'd learned about survival, deception, and the careful balance between appearing evil while doing good. The call came at midnight, delivered by Mrs. Carmichael with the urgent tone that had become familiar since Sarah joined the estate's inner operations. "Mr. Thornfield needs you immediately," the housekeeper said through the intercom. "There's been a development in the Fleming matter that requires your specialized attention." Sarah dressed quickly in the dark clothing that had become her uniform. For night operations, her mind already racing through possibilities. David Fleming had been moved to a secure facility outside the estate after her successful interrogation, supposedly to await final disposition once Marcus verified the intelligence she'd extracted. But Sarah had been secretly monitoring communications about David's situation, using access codes Elena had provided as part of her integration into the underground medical network. She found Marcus in his office, pacing with the controlled agitation of a man whose carefully laid plans were encountering unexpected complications. On his desk lay photographs, documents, and what appeared to be a laptop computer displaying financial records that made his expression darken with each screen he reviewed. "We have a problem," Marcus said without preamble. "The intelligence you extracted from Fleming appears to have been incomplete or perhaps deliberately misleading." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach, but kept her expression neutrally professional. "What kind of complications?" "The evidence cache he described doesn't exist at the location he specified. The backup copies he claimed to have created are nowhere to be found. Either your interrogation techniques were less effective than Dr. Rodriguez believed, or Fleming is considerably more sophisticated than we gave him credit for." Marcus's tone carried implicit threats that Sarah had learned to recognize. He was questioning either her competence or her loyalty, both of which could prove fatal if she couldn't provide satisfactory explanations. Subjects under pharmaceutical influence sometimes confabulate, Sarah replied, drawing on Elena's training to provide technically accurate deflection. The compounds that lower psychological defenses can also affect memory formation. He may have provided information he genuinely believed to be accurate. Perhaps, Marcus said, but his expressions suggested skepticism. Which is why I need you to conduct a more intensive examination. Fleming is being transferred back here tonight. I want you to extract every piece of information he possesses, using whatever methods prove necessary. The assignment was a test disguised as an operational necessity. Marcus suspected that Sarah's previous interrogation had been compromised somehow, and he was giving her the opportunity to prove her loyalty by correcting whatever mistakes had occurred. If she failed again, or if he detected any signs of deception, both she and David Fleming would likely face permanent elimination. But Sarah had been preparing for this possibility since her first encounter with David 3 months earlier. During her apparent integration into Marcus's operations, she'd been building a network of her own, contacts within law enforcement, connections to investigative journalists, and most importantly, alliances with other women trapped in similar circumstances who were ready to fight back. I'll need complete access to the subject, Sarah said, projecting the cold professionalism that Marcus expected from his medical assets. No observers, no time constraints, and authority to use any pharmaceutical protocols I deem necessary. Marcus nodded, pleased by her apparent dedication to the assignment. Of course, Dr. Rodriguez is out of the country on another consultation, so you'll be working alone. Mrs. Carmichael can provide whatever assistance you require. As Sarah left Marcus's office to prepare for the evening's work, she activated a communication system she'd been secretly building for months. The encrypted messages she sent would alert her network that the final phase of her plan was beginning, that tonight would determine whether she could destroy Marcus Thornfield's operation from within or whether she would die in the attempt. David Fleming arrived at the estate unconscious, transported in a medical van that suggested he'd been kept in poor condition to weaken his resistance to whatever interrogation awaited him. As Sarah examined his physical state in the basement medical facility, she felt rage building at the systematic cruelty that had been inflicted on someone whose only crime was trying to expose political corruption. But rage could be useful if properly channeled. Sarah had learned to transform her anger into surgical precision, using emotions as tools rather than allowing them to compromise her strategic thinking. He's been chemically suppressed for the past week, Mrs. Carmichael reported, consulting medical records that documented David's treatment at the secure facility. Dr. Rodriguez's protocols called for gradual pharmaceutical conditioning to increase susceptibility to advanced interrogation techniques. Sarah reviewed the chemical history, noting with professional appreciation how systematically David's psychological defenses had been dismantled. Elena's pharmaceutical expertise was truly remarkable and completely monstrous in its applications. I'll need privacy for the initial phases, Sarah told Mrs. Carmichael. The techniques I'm planning to use require absolute concentration. As the housekeeper departed, Sarah began the most dangerous deception of her life. Instead of preparing the torture compounds Marcus expected, she synthesized medications that would counteract the chemical conditioning David had endured while creating the appearance of increased vulnerability. When David regained consciousness, his eyes held the glazed confusion of someone who'd been systematically drugged for weeks. But Sarah could see intelligence beneath the pharmaceutical haze, the spark of someone who'd refused to be completely broken despite everything he'd endured. David, she whispered, moving close enough that security cameras couldn't record her words. I know you can hear me. I'm going to help you, but you need to trust me completely. The plan she outlined in urgent whispers was audacious in its complexity and terrifying in its risks. Sarah had discovered that David's evidence wasn't hidden in physical locations. It was stored in encrypted digital files that he'd memorized access codes for, then deliberately allowed himself to be captured to protect the information while his contacts prepared to expose the corruption network. But David's sacrifice would be meaningless if Marcus's people located his allies before. The evidence could be released. Sarah needed to buy time while appearing to extract information that would actually protect David's network, rather than compromise it. "The next few hours are going to be horrible," she told him quietly. "You're going to experience pain and fear that will seem completely real. But remember that I'm controlling everything you feel, and none of it will cause permanent damage." Using Elena's pharmaceutical techniques, Sarah induced physical sensations that simulated extreme torture while actually protecting David's nervous system from harm. To security cameras and audio monitors, his screams and pleas would sound like successful interrogation. In reality, Sarah was coaching him through a performance that would convince Marcus of her loyalty while buying time for David's allies to complete their mission. The deception required perfect timing and coordination. Sarah had to appear ruthlessly effective while actually providing David with chemical protection from the apparent torture she was inflicting. Every injection had to look like escalating pharmaceutical abuse while actually strengthening his resistance to genuine interrogation techniques. As the night progressed, Sarah extracted what appeared to be devastating intelligence about David's network: names, locations, plans, and access codes that would allow Marcus to destroy the investigation and eliminate everyone involved. But the information she obtained was actually an elaborate misinformation campaign designed to send Marcus's people after false targets while protecting the real investigators. "Outstanding work," Marcus said when Sarah reported her results at dawn. "You've exceeded even Dr. Rodriguez's expectations for pharmaceutical interrogation. This intelligence will allow us to neutralize Fleming's entire network before they can release any damaging evidence." Sarah felt sick satisfaction at Marcus's pleased expression. He was congratulating her for providing information that would actually protect the very people he intended to harm, praising her for a loyalty that was really its perfect opposite. But the most dangerous phase of her plan was still ahead. Marcus would act on the intelligence immediately, and when his operations failed to locate the targets Sarah had described, he would realize he'd been deceived. Sarah had perhaps 12 hours before her deception was discovered, and lethal retaliation began. Those 12 hours would determine whether her months of careful preparation could destroy Marcus Thornfield's criminal empire, or whether she would join the long list of women who had underestimated his ruthlessness. As Sarah watched Marcus coordinate the operations that would waste his resources chasing phantoms, she activated the final phase of her network's counterattack. The evidence David Fleming had sacrificed himself to protect was already being released to journalists, prosecutors, and regulatory agencies across multiple jurisdictions. By evening, Marcus Thornfield's political protections would be gone, his business empire would be under federal investigation, and his estate would be surrounded by law enforcement agencies that could no longer be intimidated or bought. But Sarah's personal reckoning was just beginning. When Marcus discovered her betrayal, she would face the concentrated fury of a man whose power had been built on the systematic destruction of women who challenged his authority. The difference was that this time he would be facing a woman who had learned to use his own weapons against him, who had transformed his intended victim into his perfect nemesis. The final confrontation came at sunset, when Marcus returned to the estate with the killing rage of someone who had realized too late that he'd been outmaneuvered by prey. He'd thought completely controlled. Sarah was waiting for him in his office, seated calmly behind his desk with David Fleming beside her. No longer a broken prisoner, but a federal witness whose testimony would help convict dozens of corrupt officials. "I underestimated you," Marcus said, his voice carrying deadly appreciation for the scope of Sarah's deception. "I thought I was acquiring a broken woman, grateful for my protection. Instead, I brought home a viper that spent months learning to strike." "You made a fundamental error," Sarah replied, standing to face the man who had tried to purchase her like property. "You assumed that a woman who couldn't bear children was somehow less than complete. But my infertility freed me from the vulnerabilities that you used to control other women. I had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for." The estate was already surrounded by federal agents. Marcus's political allies were being arrested simultaneously across 3 states, and his underground medical network was being dismantled by agencies that had been secretly investigating its activities for months. Sarah's apparent collaboration had provided the evidence needed to destroy an entire criminal conspiracy. But the personal victory was more profound than any legal outcome. Sarah Henderson had transformed herself from a discarded wife into an instrument of justice, using skills acquired through apparent corruption to protect the innocent and destroy the guilty. As Marcus Thornfield was led away in handcuffs, Sarah realized that her journey had come full circle. The woman who had been sold because she couldn't bear children had proven that her worth wasn't measured by her reproductive capacity, but by her courage, intelligence, and refusal to accept defeat. The estate that had been her prison became a federal crime scene, but Sarah was finally free to choose her own path. She had options now, opportunities to use her medical skills legitimately, chances to help other women escape similar situations, possibilities she'd never imagined when Daniel Mitchell signed papers that had seemed to end her life. Standing in the Vermont mountains, where she'd discovered her true strength, Sarah understood that sometimes the cruelest betrayals become the doorways to the most extraordinary transformations. She had been sold like property and treated like a broken thing, but she had emerged as someone whose worth couldn't be calculated by anyone else's standards. The woman they had discarded for her inability to create life had instead chosen to save lives to protect the innocent, and to prove that strength comes not from conforming to others' expectations, but from refusing to accept their limitations. Sarah Henderson walked away from the Thornfield estate as the sun set behind the mountains, free at last to discover what she could become when no one else was defining her value. Her story was ending where it began, with a journey into the unknown, but this time she was traveling toward possibilities rather than running from despair. The world had tried to convince her that she was worthless because she couldn't bear children. Instead, she had discovered that her greatest strength lay not in creating life, but in defending it against those who would destroy it for profit and power. And that, Sarah realized as she walked toward her new beginning, was a legacy worth more than any child she might have borne. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.